Hi, my name's Cheese, and welcome to another Fossil Sweeper Progress Update video. If you haven't heard of the project before, you can find an overview here, but the TLDR is, it's like Minesweeper but you're digging up fossils, and you get to build skeletons out of the stuff you find. For the past month or so, across the New Year period, I've been continuing to work on Museum UI. Since we've more or less passed the 2-year anniversary of me working on this project, I want to take some time to look back at the past year's worth of development and reflect on what's to come before we dive into more recent work. During 2023, I was able to get the research phase in and functional, which was the last gameplay loop that wasn't represented in the game. It fills a sort of buffer role, helping to manage scarcity of fossils and giving purpose to fossil surpluses. Players are able to spend skeleton chunks and Misc fossils they find on new rooms, fixtures, furnishings, and displays for their museum, and eventually other unlockables like extra abilities for the dig phase. I added a new chunk selector UI to the research phase that's more in line with where I'm planning to take other bits and pieces of the UI, where fossil chunks are given a presentation and prominence that goes beyond what's seen elsewhere. They're the core of the game, and it doesn't really make sense to hide them behind buttons with text on them. The museum phase has always represented the largest collection of work items within the project. Since it's where players will go to bask in their findings and learn about cool prehistoric stuff, it needs to be well-rounded, scalable, and maybe even feel like a solid standalone experience. Homing in on the right fit for interaction and editing has taken some time and experimentation, as I expected it to from the outset. And across the past year or so, I think I've managed to flesh out the temp museum enough to have a good handle on how things will need to be in the final implementation. I've stepped further away from avatar-driven editing interfaces, separating the museum out into discrete interact and edit modes, which I think make both contexts flow better. This has had implications for the control schemes, and one of the most recent things I've done at the time of writing is bring full gamepad and keyboard controls online for museum editing, something I needed in order to make more final decisions on the functional requirements of the museum's user interface. The temp museum gained a bunch of additional placeholder content as I implemented skeleton mounts and display cases for Misc fossils. I also added placeholder informational displays for each of the 4 placeholder skeletons in the game, which are unlocked in the research phase by spending that species' fossils. Inspecting skeletons in interact mode now gives an additional UI that reuses some of the chunk selector stuff from the research phase, and presents information on each of the fossil chunks that make up a skeleton, outlining their origin, age, and discovery in a way that I hope highlights their composite nature and resonates with how real-world fossil reconstructions typically draw upon the remains of multiple individuals. Giving the players actions in the dig and assembly phases some more presence in the museum feels like it adds something valuable to the game as a whole too. There are new control UIs for adjusting the lighting and music in museum rooms, which I'm hoping will give players the latitude to set tone and atmosphere that's appropriate for the specimens they're showcasing. The music implementation allows for individual instruments to be toggled within the museum-specific music track, but also allows other tracks from across the game to be used. Test builds now also ship with a small to medium-sized museum consisting of a dozen or so rooms and additional skeletons and fossils from the prototype to use as an example and testbed for room customization options and other editing interfaces. Other areas that got significant attention in 2023 include new placeholder environment backgrounds for the dig phase, suggesting 8 different biomes. Currently I think the rainforest is probably the one that feels most interesting, but these are mostly used to explore tone and communicate different dig sites occur in different locations and aren't really final yet. I added some more placeholder abilities for the dig phase as part of making sure that the ability system was flexible and extendable in the way that I need it to be. Being able to reveal all empty tiles with the highest count of adjacent fossils is in the ballpark of the kind of abilities I want the players to have access to. It doesn't immediately solve a dig, but it can have an impact on how the dig site is approached, and that's interesting. I added several more types of placeholder Misc fossils and updated the dig phase to control how many possible Misc fossils can contain something. Misc fossil tiles in the dig phase affect how many skeleton chunks are present, and having some possible Misc fossils be empty also helps me tune things in a way to make sure that they themselves aren't too common either. The map phase guarantees a more even spread of size and difficulty when new dig sites are added, rather than just being random, making sure there's always something approachable as well as something challenging on the table. Avatars now have footsteps in all phases, using initial audio from Jasmine. This is keyed to the walk animation, so it speeds up and gets louder when moving faster. In 2023, I added 4 new dig music tracks from Peter, and implemented per biome music along with the environment background work to help reinforce the sense of distinct places. Peter composed new music for the research phase, put together new music variants for the map phase and assembly phase's puzzle mode to fit the lower energy of those contexts, and reworked the museum music into a larger piece with per instrument layers that can be toggled on or off per room. Peter and I also worked together on a proper song for the game's credits, where I wrote an initial piece, and Peter improved and fleshed it out. He got a vocalist in for recording towards the end of last year, and is continuing to work on finishing up the track. Another significant change was settling on the new name for the project. Bonesweeper was always a working title, and while it had a lot going for it, it didn't really communicate the game's paleontology focus, and was also already being used by a spooky-themed Minesweeper-style game that I'd become aware of later. After taking some time to get used to it, I'm feeling very happy with Fossil Sweeper. Balancing other commitments made 2023 a slower year than I had hoped, but I think I was still able to make significant forward progress in spite of that, particularly when fleshing out the temp museum, adding in the research phase, and implementing Misc fossil discovery flow. The addition of new music, dig environment backgrounds, and sound effects help make the game's spaces feel more grounded and compelling, and I think the new UI and control improvements pull the game closer to where it needs to be. Looking ahead, a good amount of work still remains to do in 2024. There are things that I mentioned at the end of 2022 that I haven't yet given attention to, like finalising the look and feel of fossils and specimens, finalising the type of character customization the game will offer, implementing rare specimen dig sites, making final continent assets for the map phase, and re-implementing size variation for skeletons. Other things I'm planning to move on once I wrap up my current focus include museum room material customization, wall colour, floor types, that sort of thing, finalising the GUI look and feel and iconography, a system for notifications when completing research and unlocking new map regions, waveform preview generation for the music track selector, museum NPCs, tutorials and onboarding, non-square dig sites, and camera and placement collisions in the museum. I also need to add VFX and SFX to make player actions feel more impactful and responseful, and make all the final assets for fossils, avatars, museum rooms, furnishings, dig environments, animations, skeletons, and so on. Not to mention all the research for the museum displays. All of the gameplay loops are now in and at least functional, and I'm hoping to be able to make a start on content within the next few months. I know that I'll need to make decisions that cut away at the possibility space of the game, and find where the final version of Fossil Sweeper will end up sitting between the most minimal and larger versions of the game. And as that happens, I'll be in a better position to set expectations and start on properly getting the word out ahead of Fossil Sweeper's launch. Still moving toward getting gamepad and keyboard only controls rounded out in the temp museum, I added some focus handling for the museum HUD's edit buttons that use the same shortcuts as the new proximity item selection interface. I added buttons for the music and lighting control interfaces for the edit menu, and I'm thinking of removing the in-world control panels altogether to better delineate between the being in the museum state of interact mode and the tweaking the museum state of edit mode. Edit mode now highlights the item in the center of the viewport when moving the camera around with keyboard or gamepad controls if the mouse hasn't been moved for a while. I turn on a little pointy hand cursor and hide the mouse cursor when this happens so that it's easier to see what's going on. With that in place, I also updated box selection behavior to work with keyboard and gamepad controls too. The box now updates properly when the camera is moved or rotated. I still need to optimize this a bit more, but that can come later once I've got stuff that better represents the game's final assets. The lighting info and music info sub-HUDs now scale better when the game's window size changes, and I've been working on making both navigable with keyboard and gamepad controls. While testing some text-to-speech stuff, I realised that I'd never gotten around to adding TTS support for the phase instruction screen, which explains gameplay and controls. It now reads out everything sequentially, which is fine for the moment, I suppose, but it does make me mindful of the fact that I will need to have some kind of paragraph or sentence-focused behaviour for larger bodies of text in the game. Thankfully, that's more or less confined to the informational displays in the museum, so won't be having to balance potentially conflicting UI requirements based on context. I also noticed that the instruction screen wasn't scrollable with keyboard or gamepad controls, so I fixed that up too. A very big thank you to the supporters going by on screen at the moment. Their support has helped me eat while making this game, and I am so very appreciative. A huge thanks also to Screen Tasmania, who supported this project with a small grant. Anyway, that's about it for today. If you'd like to keep track of development or try the playable prototype, you can find some links in the description. And if you're super keen to check out what we talked about here today, I make early test builds available to my supporters on Patreon. Thanks for watching, and goodbye!